Hello, everyone. I am Eric Lufer, the president of the Citizens Research Council of Michigan. I'd like to welcome you to CRC's webinar to address budget difficulties in addressing road funding. This webinar is being presented by the Citizens Research Council of Michigan. CRC is a statewide, not-for-profit public affairs research group. This is CRC's 99th year of operation, longevity we attribute to our promotion of sound public policy for state and local governments through accurate, independent, and objective research. We are a private, not-for-profit entity, and we rely on charitable contributions of foundations, businesses, and corporations. I'd like to encourage you all to join our circle of supporters and help us to continue to provide high-quality, independent information on important policy topics in Michigan. Please note that we are recording this webinar and we will post it to our webpage where it will be available for future viewing. Also, we have everyone but the presenters on mute, so we will not be able to hear you if you speak. To ask a question, please type the questions into the questions pane that should be appearing on the GoToWebinar dialog box on your screen. You can type these questions in at any time. If you have any difficulties hearing us or seeing us during the webinar, please let us know by calling 517-485-9444. After the webinar, you will be receiving an email soliciting your feedback, and we would very much appreciate any ideas you have on how we could do this better. Now, road funding has been an ongoing issue in Michigan. The Citizens Research Council of Michigan spent much of the spring this year analyzing Proposal 1 and then presenting our analysis around the state. Since the defeat of that proposal, the legislature has been rehashing the options for funding roads without much success of settling on a proposal that can glean the requisite number of votes to send to the governor's office. Recent news from those discussions have suggested the leading ideas would raise some new level of road funding from tax increases, with the balance of the targeted amounts of new road funding to come from redirected general fund dollars. Alas, but budgeting is not so simple. For the idea of redirecting dollars assumes that there are extra dollars to be redirected, or some must receive less so that the roads can receive more. As students of the budget, CRC has approached this issue of funding general fund dollars for roads from two different angles. First, we have looked at the overall level of discretionary dollars available in the general fund. Because of Michigan's propensity to earmark tax revenues to preferred programs, the legislature has fewer discretionary dollars to move around than it would appear at first blush. Second, we look at known events that will draw upon general fund resources to examine how much may be left over for roads. These two issues are discussed in recent papers we published. The first one, the Michigan budget, back on the roads again, and the second one, earmarking state tax revenues, tying policymakers' hands or protecting policy priorities. Both of those papers are available on our website. In addition, the slides that we're going to go through are available on our website, and you can pop over there and look at those real quick or download them if you need to. Just scroll down a little bit on the home page, and on the right side are you'll see a link for resources and then presentations, and then you'll see right away at the top of that list is this. So today's webinar will be presented by Bob Schneider and Craig Thiel. Bob joined CRC in February of 2013 after having most recently served as the Associate Director for the nonpartisan Michigan House Fiscal Agency. During his 16-year tenure at House Fiscal, he developed extensive expertise and provided nonpartisan advice and analysis to state House members on state policy and budget matters in areas dealing with corrections, human services, and transportation. Craig joined CRC in 2006 and currently serves as Senior Research Associate assigned to education matters. Before coming to CRC, Craig worked for the Senate Fiscal Agency for 6 years and for the House Fiscal Agency for 3 years. Previous to this time, he was with the Michigan previous to this time with the Michigan legislature, Craig held positions with the Michigan Department of State and with the United States Environmental Protection Agency in Chicago. With that, let me turn things over to Craig.
Good afternoon. I'm going to be splitting the presentation duties with my colleague Bob, and I'm going to go first. I wanted to just outline the presentation, give you a sense of the roadmap. As Eric mentioned, this webinar largely draws from the two reports that we issued during the summer. Both of them addressed the common theme, and that was issues and challenges that state lawmakers are going to face if in trying to craft a long-term road funding solution in the wake of Proposal 1's defeat last spring. The first topic we're going to cover is just kind of a quick overview of where the road funding deliberations stand today after some work this summer. Secondly, we want to look at this challenge of tax earmarking, and if the direction is to reprioritize state spending, and despite the fact that there's a $54 billion state budget, how much is really discretionary and available for reprioritizing as they look for a solution on the roads. Third item we want to talk about is provide an update on where current revenue projections are and an assessment as to whether or not growth is ample to fund roads. Basically, can we take the general fund growth that's projected and allocate it for roads? And then finally, if there is some consensus to move general fund money to roads, what does this mean for the rest of the budget? The large areas of the state budget that rely on the general fund, what does it mean for potential reductions there, and to what extent? Basically, we want to talk about some of the trade-offs that lawmakers might face. So turning to really a quick overview of what's going on with transportation funding and the problem at hand. In a nutshell, as this chart shows, revenue is not keeping pace with the investment need of the system. We can see here that transportation revenue, primarily the vehicle registration taxes and motor fuel taxes that are earmarked for roads and cannot be used for other purposes, largely flat in nominal terms. The gasoline tax was last raised in 1997, and after rising for a number of years after that initial tax increase, largely because of the consumption of fuel rising, not because of the rate changing, it's been fairly flat, around $2 billion total for the last 10 years. When we look at the dedicated revenue adjusted for inflation, it's declined from about $1.7 billion in 2004 to just under $1.3 billion. That's a reduction of 22%. So while the nominal dollars are flat, the real dollars available for road funding in the state has declined about 25–22% in the last 10 years. And it's a little surprise with declining investment that road conditions are deteriorating. This chart shows the condition of federal aid eligible non-trunk line roads in each year, 2005 through 2013. It measures the share of lane miles on the non-highway roads by their current condition, good, fair, and poor. I want to draw your attention to the segment in red. That's the poor condition. And this rose from 15% in 2005 to 43% in 2013. So at the same time that the larger share of the roads were getting in poor condition, we can see a smaller share staying in that green band. And in 2005, about 22% of lane miles were in good condition, and that has declined to 16% in 2013. And I think if we showed you what it looked like on the trunk line system, basically the major highways in the state, it's a very similar chart, the red segment growing and the green segment shrinking. So just to recap a little bit about the history of the road funding talks, this problem is of stagnating revenue and deteriorating condition is not unknown to policymakers. It's been studied by numerous legislative study groups, and all of them have come to a similar findings, basically that the system requires additional funding. Today, it's widely accepted in all corners, business, political, and the general public, that the road system requires additional investment to reverse the deterioration and return the system to a state of good condition. The big sticking point, the big question is where should the money come from? In the past 2.5 years, we've seen a number of proposals. Let me just spend a couple moments summarizing them. Governor Snyder has been arguably the most staunch supporter of increased investment in the system. This dates back to his first term in office. At that time, in a special message he delivered to the legislature, he had called for an additional $1.4 billion in new revenue. His early proposal did not advocate for a specific tax increase. He was open to fuel taxes or registration taxes. More recently, the governor had forwarded a proposal to the legislature calling for $1.2 billion in new revenue, a combination of nearly doubling the gasoline tax, raising the diesel fuel tax, and then increasing registration taxes, and this was part of his 2014 budget. Legislative interest in the governor's plan, this all-revenue plan, has been lukewarm at best. Instead of raising new revenues, as the governor wanted, the legislature has opted to redirect existing general fund resources, basically to top off those dedicated transportation funds, just to the point of providing enough resources so that we weren't leaving any federal funds on the table. And this is currently in the neighborhood of about $400 million general fund resources going to transportation. Some serious legislative debate did occur during the 2014 legislative session. There was a compromise arrived at, and that was what was encapsulated in Proposal 1 and put on the May 2015 ballot. And as the slide here shows, it involved increasing motor fuel taxes, but at the same time eliminating the sales tax that was levied on motor fuels. That would have resulted in about a net increase of the pump price between 8 and 10 cents per gallon, depending on the price of fuel. It would have raised the sales tax to 7% on all items other than fuel. This revenue would have gone to schools and local governments and some to the state general fund. It involved a registration tax increase for trucks and electric vehicles, and it eliminated the depreciation allowance in the current vehicle registration system. All told, it would have the package would have raised about $2 billion, $1.2 billion for roads, and about $800 million for these other priorities, schools, local governments, and the state budget. As we know, it went down in flames. And while the outcome of the proposal, the public vote, is not subject to debate, the message that was sent from the voters is reasonable people could argue any one of these or any combination of these interpretations here. Basically, voters could have been telling lawmakers, we don't want our taxes raised for roads. Find what you need to fix the problem out of the current budget. Another interpretation was, we want you to fix the roads. You can ask us for additional new resources for roads, but not all the other stuff, schools, local government, the state budget. An alternative interpretation could be, stop bothering us, us being the voters, just do this in a legislative fix and solve it yourself. And then finally, you know, we don't trust you at all to do what we've sent you to Lansing to do. I hope that wasn't the case. So where do things stand now that Proposal 1's failed? This summer, both the House and the Senate had passed plans leading into the summer recess. They came together in a very abbreviated late summer session to try to hash out those plans, try to find a compromise. The bottom line, no agreement was reached. We do have some indications of what a possible compromise might look like from the Senate and the House plan. Both plans had similarities in that they involved some level of new resources, but both relied heavily on redirecting existing resources, general fund resources. In some cases, the very specific earmarking of state income tax for roads, also eliminating the earned income tax credit. Those were portions of the House plan. In the case of the Senate plan, talked about taking money from the state income tax that's going to the general fund and allocating it for roads. Both plans, when fully phased in, generated the $1.2 billion, at least the $1.2 billion in additional road funding, but of course these would come with some changes in other places of the state budget. So, you know, where do things stand today? There's a consensus that the need's still there. The sticking point is the same one that existed back when Governor Snyder took office in 2011. You know, how do we get there? Raise taxes to generate new resources, and if we're going to do that, is it going to be a fuel tax? Is it going to be a registration tax? What combination? Or shifting existing resources, basically earmarking a share of the general fund to roads. And really that's what the remainder of our discussion is going to be on today, is what is involved in moving resources around in the state budget, what are the trade-offs, and you know, what share of the resources are actually at the discretion of the legislature. So I'm going to talk a little bit about state tax earmarking, really as a challenge that lawmakers are going to face here as they look to reprioritize state spending. We often hear that the state budget is $54 billion, and that finding $1.2 billion for roads shouldn't be that difficult. That represents just about a 2% share of the state budget, and if every program just took a 2% haircut, we'd have our road problem unsolved and probably with little pain. But what we need to do is to look at the composition of the state budget, really to ask the question, or to answer the question, whether or not we, you know, a 2% across the board reduction is really feasible. You know, and when we do that, when we look at that composition, we see that the federal resources, including those that are dedicated already for transportation, but also Medicaid program, also education, these federal resources constitute about 43% of the $54 billion budget. And then then when we look at the various state taxes and fees that are restricted either through the state constitution or through state law, we find that another $21 billion are earmarked already. That's about 39% of the state budget. Now, of course, lawmakers could go in and change those statutory earmarks or dedications and free those resources up for roads, but that's another political fight that they'd have to take on if they want to do that. So after we factor out the federal funds and the funds that are earmarked for specific programs, it leaves about $10 billion. That's the size of the state general fund. Roughly 19% of the total state budget is discretionary resources. And then when we look at that pot of money, we see that about 3/4 of it is already, or not already, but 3/4 of it is tied up in three large functional areas. Higher education, this is the funding for public universities and community colleges, claims about 14% of the general fund budget. The corrections program, housing about 46,000 prisoners, is responsible for about $1.9 billion, or about 20% of the general fund budget. And then the largest share is the state's obligation for the Medicaid program, and then the various human services programs totals about $4.1 billion, or about 42%. So about 25% of the budget, $2.5 billion, is tied up in other programs, and these range the gamut from just running the legislature to the Secretary of State's office and various programs there. So this chart is something to keep in mind as we move through this webinar and talk about some of the trade-offs in redirecting state spending. So one of the things we talked about in one of our reports this summer on state tax earmarking was kind of the justifications. What we found is that Michigan's relies fairly heavily on earmarking state taxes for various programs, and over the years a number of rationales have been forwarded for doing earmarking. And the most common has to do when there's a relationship between a tax and the function or state program that tax is funding. And an example here would be with transportation. We earmark transportation revenues, motor fuel taxes and vehicle registration taxes to transportation. The thinking there is that those who are benefiting from the government service are responsible for paying some of the costs of maintaining that government service, so those who use the roads should pay for it. And in doing so, there's some market forces are introduced into the government service provision, and if everything is priced right, we can get an efficient allocation of government services. Another justification is to provide a minimum level of support for a given government function. So we might earmark a share of a tax to ensure that regardless of what happens with changing preferences in the legislature, a certain program is going to receive a share of a state tax. Another justification we find for earmarking is that to increase a tax or change the state tax system, there has to be some political horse trading, some votes to get a tax increase. So earmarking is a byproduct of the political negotiations that go on. Obviously, there's some criticisms with earmarking. It introduces a significant amount of inflexibility in the budget process when programs are kind of taken out of the legislative oversight arena, when spending is deemed automatic because of the earmark. Also, there's no guarantee that the earmarked or that the non-earmarked funds for a program are going to be maintained if those earmarked funds are provided. So this is the thinking that all state dollars are green or fungible, and that if the amount of earmarked money goes up, lawmakers can remove the non-earmarked or discretionary funds that are allocated to a program. And finally, we see that earmarking creates distortions in tax and spending levels, something that might be a priority years ago when the earmark was created isn't a priority today. It also might result in taxes being raised for programs unnecessarily because lawmakers are unable to free up funds from a program that are receiving earmarked funds, and taxes have to go up to support other programs. So, and that increase might not be justified if lawmakers were able to move funds between programs more freely. So as I mentioned, Michigan relies pretty heavily on earmarking. And this chart, which goes back almost 50 years, shows that. It shows that since Proposal A in 1995, when about 58% of total state taxes were earmarked, that share's gone up to about 63%, most recently in 2014. So that increase of 5 percentage points amounts to about $1.3 billion of state resources that were previously discretionary in nature and now are earmarked for various programs. The big jump from 93 to 95 is obviously the Proposal A school finance reforms, the shift from local property tax to state sales tax to finance schools, and the earmarking of those state taxes, including the increase in the sales tax and some of the income tax for schools. So we can see that about almost 2/3 of the state tax revenue, general state tax revenue, is earmarked for specific purposes. And looking forward, we know that there's more earmarking on the horizon. The personal property tax reforms from 2014 that are going to be coming online in fiscal year 2016 are guaranteeing that local governments who lose revenue, local personal property tax revenue, are going to be reimbursed through a share of the state use tax. Currently, the use tax earmarking is about 33%. That's going to jump up and nearly double over the lifespan of these personal property tax exemptions to 66%. So by 2023, the amount of use tax that's earmarked going to go from about 33% to 66%, double. The result, or for state policymakers, is this means that over the coming years, proportionally fewer resources are going to be available on an annual basis for discretionary purposes. So today, looking at reprioritizing state spending, you know, lawmakers have to really decide if they're going to use additional discretionary resources for transportation. It then brings transportation into the debate about you know, what should be funded, what's a priority today versus the other programs that rely on the general fund. That's the, you know, corrections programs, the healthcare and human services programs, public universities. Transportation is going to be competing against a limited pot of resources. Again, we estimate that about $1.3 billion in earmarked revenue has been taken off the table since 1995, and that number is going to go up. And as lawmakers move forward with the road debate, they're going to have to weigh the trade-offs between more transportation spending and the demands in other areas of the general fund budget. And at that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob to talk about some of the revenue issues on the horizon, as well as some spending pressures facing state lawmakers.
Thank you, Craig. So as Craig discussed, we often think of the state budget as being about a $54 billion state budget, but as Craig discussed, both federal aid and then this earmarked state revenue limits the pool of discretionary revenue available to lawmakers to that $10 billion general fund, general purpose pot. So the discretionary revenue being a much smaller subset of the total budget. Still, many lawmakers have pointed to that discretionary pool and thought, well, why can't we tap into those discretionary GFGP revenues for the roads? To many, that's a better alternative than a tax increase, which is, of course, always politically difficult to support. So this segment of the webinar is going to focus on analyzing the long-term state budget picture and look at some of the ramifications, the potential ramifications of redirecting some of that pool of state discretionary GFGP dollars to the roads. The good news on this front is that general fund, general purpose revenues are expected to grow at a fairly healthy clip here in the near term. This chart looks at revenue estimates for general fund coming out of the May 2015 Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference. And looking ahead, we see the estimates call for an additional roughly $240 million in revenue for fiscal year 2017 over the revenues on which the fiscal year 2016 current budget just passed this summer is based. And then going out further in fiscal year 2018, we're looking at a cumulative increase of just over $600 million. And by fiscal year 2019, almost $1 billion in additional revenue over what the fiscal year 2016 base budget is built on. So that suggests, at least just looking at the revenue side, that you potentially have revenue growth that could be used to help fund any policy priority, but particularly the key priority of roads today. And many policymakers have pointed to this revenue growth and suggested, well, why not tap into that growth? We'll be able to fund the roads and potentially still have funding left over to provide growth to the rest of the budget as well. The issue is, however, while the growth is indeed healthy, to get a complete picture of the state budget, you need to look at both the revenue side and the expenditure side. Well, we may have a, oh, thank you. I think I advanced my slide one too many. Thanks for catching that to my team here. So we need to look at both the expenditure and the revenue side together. In our analysis in the recent report, the Michigan Budget Back on the Roads again that came out last month, we identified 4 such spending pressures that are going to offset a good chunk of this new revenue growth that we talked about in the prior slide. The first that we show here is the Medicaid expansion. So in 2013, the Michigan legislature approved the Medicaid expansion as allowed for in the Affordable Care Act. That got the governor's signature, and currently the state is spending about $4 billion a year on this new Medicaid eligible population, primarily childless adults with low income. To this point, the federal government is covering 100% of these healthcare coverage related costs for the state. So the $4 billion is all coming from the federal government. The good news for the state in passing the Medicaid expansion is it has generated some state savings. We estimate, and in fact built into the budget in fiscal year 2016, is about $250 million in savings related to the expansion. That's the result of Medicaid picking up the costs of state-funded programs that would have been responsible for health care for certain individuals prior to the expansion. So for instance, the most prominent program is behavioral health, mental health programs. Prior to the expansion, we had a large subset of low-income adults that would have received state-funded mental health services, and with the expansion, those adults have become Medicaid eligible and are getting federally funded Medicaid coverage. That's created savings for the state. Corrections healthcare is another prominent example of where the state has achieved some savings. But now the state will begin to need to provide matching funds for this Medicaid expansion. Beginning in calendar year 2017, the state is going to be expected to pay 5% of the coverage-related costs of the expansion. That will phase up to 10% by calendar year 2020. And our estimates in our report suggest the general fund costs, the escalating general fund costs from these match requirements will start at $160 million in new general fund general purpose costs in fiscal year 2017, and that should expand to about $310 million by fiscal year 2019. So again, that's really related to the state picking up a larger share than, or some share of the expansion costs that are currently funded by the federal government. Another spending pressure revolves around the state's use tax and some Medicaid special financing. Currently, the state's 6% use tax, which is sort of the companion to our state sales tax, you and I may pay it on internet purchases, for instance. That 6% tax is also applied to Medicaid health maintenance organizations, Medicaid HMOs, and the revenue from that tax helps to finance our Medicaid program, and it generates about $400 million in general fund, general purpose revenue each year. From the HMO perspective, from the Medicaid HMOs, this is really not any financial harm for them. They pay the tax, and the federal Medicaid laws require these managed care organizations to get what they call actuarially sound reimbursement rates. So they pay the tax, that's a cost to the HMOs, and the reimbursement rates from Medicaid pay them back the same money. So no harm for the HMOs. From the state's perspective, it's a boon for the state general fund. We collect $400 million in general fund revenue, but in that payback to the HMOs, we actually pay less because the feds pick up about 2/3 of those costs through their federal matching funds. So while the state collects $400 million, we only pay back about 1/3 of that ourselves to the HMOs. The feds help out by picking up the rest of the costs. So now there's extra general fund revenue, and that helps with our budget. What the feds have said is we're not going to allow that anymore. Starting in January 2007, by the end of the current legislative session, the feds have notified the state that it must cease and desist with this special use tax. There are a couple other states, at least, that are in the same boat, and due to some changes in federal laws, the feds are going to require states to stop with this particular type of mechanism, and that's going to cause then the loss of that revenue and cause a budget strain. Linked to that same use tax is what's called the HICA, the Health Insurance Claims Assessment, which is currently a 3/4% tax on paid claims for Michigan residents in this state. The HICA law adjusts that rate up from 0.75 to 1% if the feds disallow the use tax as they have. So actually that component of it will help fill a little bit of the hole that the loss of the use tax will bring about. But another issue for the legislature is that HICA actually sunsets itself in January 2018. So in order to maintain the HICA, the legislative action is going to be necessary somewhere down the road. In net, when we factor in the use tax and the HICA together, our analysis suggests probably about $125 to $150 million in new general fund spending will be required to make up for the hole that's going to be created in the budget, and that assumes that the HICA is maintained through time. Again, another budget pressure that will eat into some of that revenue growth. A third spending pressure revolves around some one-time spending that's built into the fiscal year 2016 budget, and that's related to the state's Quality Assurance Assessment Program. The state imposes a QAP tax on hospitals and nursing homes, and again, this helps finance the Medicaid program. The idea is very similar to the use tax. The state imposes a tax, these providers, the hospitals and nursing homes, pay the tax. Each dollar that's brought in could help to bring in $2 federal and match for the Medicaid program. So in the end, even though these healthcare providers pay the tax, they end up getting more back in reimbursement once the state QAP dollars are used to match federal dollars, and it gets pushed back to the providers. So it's a win for the providers. They end up winning on the reimbursement side of the equation. But the state also benefits from it because they retain some of those QAP dollars as retainer savings. It's frequently called the state retainer. So we hold back a little bit of it. We pay back enough to the hospitals and nursing homes to help them increase their reimbursement, but hold on to a little bit of it to help defer general fund needs in the Medicaid program as a whole. What happened in the fiscal year 2016 budget deal, and this was related to discussions and controversies, a budget fight related to graduate medical education. As part of the budget deal, hospitals agreed to allow the state to up that retainer, those state retained savings to by $93 million, but only for fiscal year 2016. That was part of the budget deal. So presumably then in fiscal year 2017 and beyond, once you lose those one-time savings, there's going to be a need to add $93 million in general fund, general purpose revenue back to the budget to make up for the loss of those one-time savings. And then finally, every year there's general inflationary budget pressures that exist. The most prominent are employee compensation, and here we don't just mean pay, but also employee health care costs. We mean retirement costs related to state employees. And then beyond that, we have our social services caseloads, and the biggest driver there is the state Medicaid caseload. This chart shows that between fiscal year 2012 and fiscal year 2016, the last 5 enacted budgets, the state has needed anywhere between $65 million and $240 million in general fund, general purpose appropriations to cover these expanded costs. And in our report, we assume that in the outgoing years, we're going to need about $100 million per year through fiscal year 2019 to meet similar costs down the road. So in August, the legislature and the governor were reportedly very near to a deal that would have generated the magic number of $1.2 billion in new resources for the roads, and reportedly that would have involved $600 million in new revenue from increased taxes and $600 in redirected revenue from existing general fund resources. So in our report, we asked, well, how would this impact the big picture of the budget? What would it look like if we combine our revenue projections and these spending estimates and spending pressures that are now known? And this slide does just that. So here we assume, one, that our consensus GFGP revenue estimates hold. We assume that the revenue declines related to the elimination of the Medicaid use tax hold, and those are shown on top in the revenue section. We assume flat spending going forward with one exception, and that's those 4 budget pressures that we noted in the previous slides, which are in their own row in the expenditure section of the chart. We assume no further contributions to the Budget Stabilization Fund after fiscal year 2016, where there's a planned $95 million contribution. We assume that goes forward, but nothing further. And then we assume that this permanent use of $600 million in general fund is put in place for the roads. So what does that mean in terms of GFGP spending down the road? What does it mean in terms of necessary cuts? And we highlight that in the section on GFGP growth and reductions. The state currently has almost $9.5 billion budgeted for in GFGP for non-road purposes. Under this scenario, if a permanent contribution of $600 million in general fund for roads, that would mean immediately for fiscal year 2016, the need to cut about $177 million of that current GFGP appropriation. It's about 1.8%. By the next year, fiscal year 2017, and the budget that deliberations will begin on next February, it would mean about $482 million in cuts. That's equivalent to about 5.1% of that baseline $9.5 billion in general fund that we currently have in the budget for non-road purposes. You begin to restore some of those cuts in the next 2 years, but even in fiscal year 2019, 2 more years out, you're still down $123 million from fiscal year 2016. So 3 years later, in fiscal year 2019, those general fund programs as a whole would still be 1.3% lower than they are in the budget that was just recently enacted. And it's worth noting that Craig earlier had the chart that noted about 75% of our general fund is allocated to higher education, corrections, and social service programs. Several of these programs have already taken some pretty significant budget cutting during the first decade of the new millennium, where the state had some very significant revenue and budget challenges. This slide looks at total state resources for some of these major program areas, both in nominal actual dollar terms in the first box, and then in inflation-adjusted terms in the second box. And so you see, for instance, university funding between 2000 and 2016 down almost 20% in actual dollar terms, almost 40% in inflation-adjusted terms. Statutory revenue sharing, which is technically not a direct general fund appropriation, but effectively is discretionary revenue. It's appropriated out of some sales tax that's budgeted as restricted revenue, but it comes really right off the top of those general fund estimates. That's down, the statutory component, 44% from fiscal year 2000, and in real terms, just over 58% between 2000 and 2016. So some of these programs that depend heavily on the general fund have already seen some budget strain during the last decade and a half. In real terms, they've all shrunk at least slightly, with the exception of Medicaid and Human Services, which has seen some real growth. We did talk about one alternative path for policymakers who may be looking to cut in other ways outside the general fund, and that would be to look towards the state school aid fund. Beginning in 2010, and then again starting in 2012 to the present, the school aid fund, which had traditionally been used for K-12 education, has been used for both universities and community colleges to help fill what would have been general fund needs in those budgets. And as Craig, I think, mentioned earlier, in the fiscal year 2016 budget, that comes to about $460 million. So one option for lawmakers is to increase the school aid fund contribution to higher education. That frees up general fund resources potentially for other functions. And as this chart shows, in the last consensus revenue estimating conference, we are projecting fairly strong school aid fund growth along with the general fund. This shows over the next 3 years, between fiscal year 2016 and fiscal year 2019, the cumulative revenue growth in the school aid fund will be up about $876 million in fiscal year 2019. So again, some room potentially for diverting some of the school aid fund revenue to higher education and freeing up general fund through that path. Still, there is a trade-off here. This basically would mean less school aid fund revenue available for K-12 schools, and it would mean further shifting of school aid fund resources to programs that have been traditionally financed with general fund, general purpose revenue. This slide shows the increase in that school aid fund, those school aid fund shifts over the last several fiscal years. The top component of this slide in orange shows the general fund appropriation in the school aid fund budget. So in other words, general fund for K-12 schools. You'll see that peaked in 2013, but has fallen to a fairly small level in the current fiscal year 2016 budget, just about $46 million. Conversely, the bottom piece of this chart, the portions in blue show the amount of school aid fund revenue that has been used to finance programs in place of general fund, and other those programs that have traditionally been general fund financed. In fiscal year 2016, that includes the $460 million allocated to higher education and community colleges. That would be a prominent piece. So dipping further into the school aid fund would even would make these blue areas even larger. It would further tax and place a burden on that school aid fund beyond the increases that we've already seen over the last 5 fiscal years. So in closing, state policymakers are going to face some difficult choices this fall as they once again attempt to tackle the issue of road funding. As we noted earlier, it seems generally accepted that we now need at least about $1.2 billion in new annual resources. Some road officials argue that's even that the real need is even larger, but there seems to be a general acceptance now, Republicans, Democrats, folks in all geographic areas, that there's a need of at least $1.2 billion for the roads. But again, where is there no agreement? That's exactly how we're gonna get there. The legislature and governor are going to face the need to decide between tax increases and the burden that comes with those tax increases on the citizenry, and the redirection of revenues, which, as we've shown here, is likely to create need for cuts in other state functions. And again, for lawmakers, the challenge is really agreeing not only on how much to redirect for roads, but once any redirections applied, where is it that you're going to be able to achieve those cuts in the budget to make everything work and to make the budget maintain its structural balance. So with that, we're going to conclude our webinar. We appreciate your attendance today. Hope this information was helpful. I'm going to kick it back over to Eric Lufer to see if we've received questions, and we'll take some time to entertain those.
Thanks, Bob, and thanks, Craig, before for very insightful comments about what's been going on. We have received a few questions, and we welcome any more. If you want to put them in, you just use the GoToWebinar dialog box and type your question in. So the first two I'm going to give to Bob. First one has to deal with transit, and we can think about it in kind of bigger terms. We've read an article in the news or the Free Press lately about some of our scenic rest stops and how they've been let go because of the lack of funding. So the question is tight. Everyone keeps talking about road repair. I'm concerned that any funds raised for roads through new taxes and fees go through the funding formula of Act 51, so that public transportation and other non-road but transportation specific areas receive funding. How can we assure that the funding formula will be followed? Public transit and other modes of transportation lost out in 1997, but it seems more people need public transit today than ever in the
Well, it's a good question, and I think really it's going to be up to the legislature as to how to handle that issue. There in the Senate and House plans from this summer, there were, and I'm trying to remember the details, at least with some of the newly earmarked income and sales tax revenues, those were actually pulled out of that Act 51 formula, so that the newly earmarked revenues would not, the public transit, as you mentioned, as the questioner mentions, would not have received its traditional cut of 10% flow through the Act 51 formula. I think the public in general may, or at least lawmakers are interpreting that the public in general may have an emphasis on maximizing the amount that gets to roads. That's certainly not to say that there aren't significant public transit needs as well. So yes, how can you ensure that? There really is no way to ensure that other than, I guess, to be engaged in the political dialogue and to make sure you're, if you feel strongly there, that your lawmakers know that, because it will really be up to the it'll be up to the legislature and the governor and what he attaches his signature to decide how that works.
What is CRC's analysis of the idea being talked about in the legislature of lowering the state income tax if there is a rise in fuel taxes? This idea seems counterproductive given the general fund, general purpose situation.
Well, and actually, I'll clarify what was part of the Senate plan. It wasn't so much that the income tax rate would fall with rises in fuel taxes. The Senate had indeed put in a trigger into its package from the summer that would have called for an automatic reduction in the income tax rate if general fund, general purpose revenue as a whole grew faster than inflation. So if inflation was 1.5% and we saw in any given fiscal year 2.5% growth in general fund, it basically took, okay, how much is that excess growth? And it automatically basically gave that back in the form of an income tax cut. We have not written on it, but in the same light of what Craig talked about with earmarking, I think we would encourage the legislature to be cautious about putting those types of automatic, essentially, in a way, it's really sort of an expansion of earmarking. It's a tax expenditure, effectively. And as we just talked about in our second paper on budget pressures, there are things going on in the budget at any time. Medicaid expansion is probably a good example where we're going to have ramped up general fund needs, not to expand programs, but just to maintain that expansion at its at its status quo. And often those types of formulas don't take those factors into account. So certainly the legislature has the discretion to put that into law. I think we would encourage the legislature to be very cautious about doing that and make sure they're taking the big picture into account before deciding to turn back what's deemed excess general fund revenues.
So next question is for Craig. Does the road funding distribution formula for local units favor rural counties with less traffic over urban counties with more traffic? Is it time to change the formula? So this is something you've written about before, done research on, and I think it points to the lack of overall look for reform in this whole process.
Right, so the debate on transportation is limited to really raising the revenue and how to do that. There is some discussion, as Bob alluded to, in some of the legislative plans about pulling out public transit from any additional revenue increase and directing the dollars just to roads. There's been no discussion whatsoever when it comes to modifying the intricacies of the Public Act 51 distribution formula. That's the formula that determines how, not only how the money gets allocated between the state and local road agencies, but even among the local road agencies. And the question here touches upon the distribution between what are deemed rural counties and urban counties. And currently there are some attempts to send more resources to urban counties to account for the traffic and usage differences in urban counties. But some research that we did on that formula, we did a report in 2010 or 2011, suggested that the rural counties are making out a little better than the urban counties when we look at the distribution of these resources and the use of the infrastructure. So yes, it's the case that the formula tends to favor rural counties when looked at through a utilization kind of lens, but it hasn't been an issue that's discussed in the road funding debates as one of the reforms.
A question on the overall level of funding: will higher education benefit from a capital outlay this year?
Yeah, I don't think we really have any crystal ball insights on that one. It'll really be subject to you know, what the legislature wants to take on. I mean, they've indicated, and the governor have indicated, that roads are their main priority right now. And I think discussions of other budget items are really going to take a back seat until they solve this road funding issue.
All right. With gasoline prices down about $1 per gallon from last year, is anyone talking about a straight tax per gallon to find the 1.2 billion? In other words, has the legislature come around to the idea of taking advantage of the low fuel prices to get where we need to be with just tax increases?
Yeah, it you know, it seems the general direction right now is not to go with a straight tax increase. The question is, do you think we're going to raise this $1.2 billion purely with tax increases and without any type of redirection or general fund contribution? The tea leaves strongly suggest no, that to some degree it seems like the train is moving in a direction that's going to lead to some mix of both. I think tax increases will be a component of any solution that's arrived at, but I think it's increasingly clear that that there's also going to be a redirection of some existing revenue and a general fund contribution that's going to be a component too. I would be very surprised if there was a solution anytime soon that was purely tax increase related.
A point of clarification: when you were talking about the QAP, the QAAP, do religious hospitals pay that tax, or is it only the public hospitals?
You know, honestly, I don't know. I believe it's hospitals in general. If I don't know why there would be a exemption. Well, yeah, I do. I don't know the answer. I guess we can try to ask that question, and maybe we can put that as a Ask CRC. Throw it out there on our website.
We'll get back to you offline and try to get to you the answer to that question. So I think we are pass it back to.
Thank you, Eric. I did want to, having answered the very early question, I wanted to add one thing, and there was a very early question regarding the idea of cutting the income tax rate to adjust for general fund revenue growth that was part of the part of the Senate plan. And after I answered, I realized I missed one opportunity to comment on one particular facet of that proposal. The question was how might we view that type of proposal? One of the negatives, I think, in the Senate proposal was it was a year-by-year accounting of general fund growth. So if general fund in any given year increased greater than the rate of inflation, that automatically triggered a rate reduction and reducing tax revenue, but it did not account for declines in revenue in the subsequent year or in a prior year. It was sort of a one-year accounting and a one-year trigger. That probably has the danger of, and in fact we would have seen it back in fiscal year 2008, for instance. I think we had some fairly healthy revenue growth in the general fund just before we went into the Great Recession and the bottom dropped out of our general fund growth. I think you need to be cautious anytime you have any kind of trigger that would have a rate reduction tied to revenue growth. But in particular, if you were to do it, it would probably be wise to look over a longer period of time and balance out positives and negatives that happen year by year with revenue growth. As I looked at it, that was one facet of the Senate plan that was a little concerning, in that you could have 1 year of healthy growth and 3 years of bad growth. You get the rate reduction triggered on 1 year of healthy growth and no action to counteract that with the years of negative growth. And it just occurred to me after answering that I should probably throw that part in as well. Thanks, Eric.
Of course, Michigan does have tax limitations already. The 1978 amendment to the Constitution we refer to as the Headley Amendment has a limitation on state tax revenues. That, in retrospect, was enacted kind of at the high point in state revenues, and so we've bumped up against that limitation very few times. This would not put it at Michigan's nadir, the lowest point in our revenue, but certainly a time when revenues are far below and would hamstring things going forward, trying to recover some of the appropriations that were referred to a few slides ago on higher education and state revenue sharing and things like that that have taken some serious hits over the last couple of years. So the questions have ceased coming in. We have one more outstanding, so let me pass this to each of our commentators today, kind of looking into the crystal ball. If the legislature is not successful in dealing with road funding problem in the short term, what do you think the fallback position will be? Where do we go from here if they continue to look at each other and not get much accomplished?
And this is Bob. I think we'd be in some. I think we'd be in some trouble. I think probably this fall is probably the last best hope. I would be more pessimistic if nothing gets done this fall that something will get done next year, as legislators are looking forward to an election year. I think if nothing comes together in terms of a permanent solution this fall, there would probably be just a continued fallback. We have right now $400 million in general fund appropriated in the transportation budget. I would think that would at least be maintained. But a real issue is that as you continue to have less than optimal investment in the road system, and as Craig's slide showed earlier in the webinar, that road conditions continue to deteriorate, you dig a deeper hole to get out of, and to some extent the annual need begins to go up kind of exponentially over time. So I'd be pretty pessimistic if nothing happens this fall.
I think Bob very adequately addressed that question. So allow me to thank everyone for taking the time out of your busy days to tune in to our webinar. We have another webinar coming up on October 1st that is going to deal with local government finance. This one is being done in cooperation with the Ford School at the University of Michigan, the Center for Local, State, and Urban Policy. So it is in the afternoon of October 1st. You can find out information about that on our website, as well as the Close-Up website. This webinar has been recorded. It will be on our website shortly after this concludes. It takes some time to process it. And let us know if you have any questions, and we'll be happy to get back to you.